Add to this stream. Remove. Hello and welcome to the MRC's Particularly Interesting History. This is a co-event that's done by myself, Joseph Levermore, and Dylan Wood. Say hi, Dylan.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
I presume so, because I can hear you very well.
Okay, hi, thanks everyone for coming.
Perfect. So we'll be hearing shortly from Alison Gaines, the co-chair of the Researchers Society here at the MRC CEH. Do we have any housekeeping, Dylan?
Yeah, so we're just going to have 4 speakers and then followed by a panel discussion. So we've got Dr. Gary Fuller first, talking about the history of air pollution measurement and how that's evolved. And then we've got Professor Anna Hansell, who'll be talking about the impacts of what we know about the health impacts of air pollution exposure on human health over the life course. And then we've got Dr. Ian Mudway, who'll be talking about what we are yet to know in terms of health impacts. And then Miss Beth Gardiner to give her perspective from the journalist and a policy point of view. And then the panel discussion afterwards, after those 10 minutes talks from each of them.
Perfect. So without further ado, I will pass over to Alison, who will talk about the MRC CEH. Hey, Alison.
Hello, thanks so much. Hopefully you can hear me. I'm going to share a couple of slides, so give me 1 second. Okay. Can you guys see my screen, hopefully?
Yes, they do now.
Okay. So first of all, I wanted to say thank you so much. Hold on, here we go. Is this still working? Can you see the?
Yes, it's still working.
Strange. Okay. So I wanted to first of all say hello and a big welcome to everyone. Thank you guys for joining today. As Joseph said, my name is Allie Gaines, and I'm a second-year PhD student in the School of Public Health here at Imperial. And this also means it's my second year as a member of the MRC Center for Environment and Health. And recently, Joseph and I were elected as the co-chairs of the Researchers Society. Briefly, I wanted to give an introduction to the MRC and to the work that's being done there, as well as to the Researchers Society that operates within it. So the MRC Center for Environment and Health brings together research teams from different departments across the Faculty of Medicine at Imperial College London. There are 4 main research themes: healthy cities, healthy people, biostatistics and data science, molecular signatures and disease pathways, and most relevant to today's event, environmental exposures. Of course, there's a lot of overlap across these disciplines, which makes the MRC a great place for collaboration and growth. One of the key aims of the center is its training to create the next generation of multidisciplinary scientists working in research on environment and health. In addition to offering various master's level courses, the center funds a number of PhD studentships as well. And members often move on after their degrees to roles as early career research fellows. So now for the Researchers Society, we're the early career researchers of the MRC Center for Environment and Health. And together we work to promote the welfare and career development of researchers across the center. Our main goals are to facilitate growth and community across our members. Specifically, we provide a voice to the early career researchers, improve training and career development. We foster a community, especially amongst the lonely times of a PhD, which has been particularly helpful throughout COVID this year. And finally, we promote collaboration and communication across our members. just for a taste of some of the more fun things that we do, we have.
Sorry to interrupt. Unfortunately, the screen, the slides aren't moving.
Oh, it didn't change. Strange.
Unfortunately, it's okay.
Okay, yeah, it's you're not missing too much on the second slide.
Continue anyway.
Strange. But just for a taste of what we do, we have a number of social training and educational events, such as this one. Over the last year, we've started up a recipe club, which was not only a fun way to build our community, but also a way to promote healthier and more sustainable diets. We have a book club that meets every other month, where we can take a break from our academic reading, but also improve on our collaboration and analytical skills. And we also host film screenings and seminars multiple times throughout the year. This winter, we hosted 2 events themed around women in science and gender equality in research, which were both really successful and very, very important topic to bring to light. So yeah, we look forward to starting up and hosting a number more events throughout this year. And I want to hand it back to Dylan and Joseph. They worked super hard to set up this event, and I am so excited to listen in and see what's in store. So passing it back to you guys.
Thank you very much. That was a great introduction to what we do at the MRC and the MRC Researchers Society. Cheers, Alison. So without further ado, me and Dylan thought it would be a bit I don't know, kind of easy to quote Charles Dickens in his explanation of air pollution. So instead, we've opted for a poem. I know it's pretty niche to start a event with a poem, but I'm briefly going to read it out to you, and then this will nicely segue into Gary Fuller, who was our first speaker of the event. So your world is proud. Your man is perfect. The hills are leveled, the plain lit up. You have cleverly trimmed the tree of life. All is swept clean on your iron rails. All is great, all is fine, but we die in your air. Now the question is, Gary, how easy is it to rely on literature that was founded or written in the 1850s as our understanding of the history of air pollution exposure?
Wow, that's an interesting question. Oops. Hello. Yeah, that's a fantastic question, and it very much plays to some of the difficulties about understanding the air pollution we've been exposed to in the past, mainly because we just don't have measurements, and what we have to go a lot on is people's descriptions. But perhaps if I can explain some of that through my presentation. If I can just start sharing now. Can someone tell me if that's working or not?
It is working, but there seems to be quite a lot of feedback. So
there does seem to be.
So what I'll do is I'll just quickly open up the presentation you sent across to myself. Here, and I'll present from my screen.
Yeah, okay. So I'll just begin here. I was asked to talk about or give a brief history of air pollution in probably somewhere in the region of about 10 minutes, which is a bit of a challenge really to summarize several hundred years. So what I thought I would do is try and answer a question. If you could move on to the next slide for me, Dylan. Okay. So I was prompted. I did this piece in the Guardian 2 or 3 weeks ago, and about plastic burning and the way that it was affecting air pollution for the people living in India. And when the piece was published, I looked at the photograph that the picture desk had put with it, and we have this photo of a gentleman cycling through the polluted air in an Indian city. And it really struck me that this is very much similar to the types of imagery that we have from the London 1952 smog, and I've attached a couple of those there. And that really prompts the question of, is the air pollution that this person is experiencing traveling around on his bike, has it ever been this bad? How does it compare to what we've had before? So I had a quick little forage into the WHO database, and I found the mean air pollution that they at the moment is reported as an annual mean PM2.5 across Indian cities, 190 micrograms per cubic meter. So how does this compare to what we've had before? If you can move on to the next slide, please. Okay, so do you want to hit that as the full screen version? Maybe that'll fit better. We lose the panels around you. That's the one, I think. No, maybe not. Okay, so normally when we're talking about past air pollution, the story starts with John Evelyn. And Ian, I know, is a big fan, but John Evelyn lived in London in the 1660s, and he published a wonderful letter and a report to the king at the time about the state of air pollution in the city. Before this time, most of what we'd had to go on to understand air pollution was kind of like accounts of nuisance. So we have things like when people were smelting iron in the city of London and the restrictions that were put upon them, or the use of coal to heat castles and so forth. But John Evelyn here tries to describe air pollution across a whole city. He talks about, in the main text, as you can see this, he talks about this journey that he was making through Northumberland House, Scotland Yard, and he was finding air pollution so thick that men could hardly discern each other for the cloud. And when he talks about London as a whole, he talks about smoke so heavy with soot that it falls upon the city, where it disperses and spreads, making London look like Troy after the Greeks had sacked it. And he doesn't just talk about air pollution locally, as it is in London. He's also appreciative of the far wider impacts, such as reports that French vines are actually being affected and killed by smoke from England. So clearly, you know, air pollution at this time was just absolutely horrendous, and was just defacing the city as well as the people that lived within it. Next slide, please, Joseph. But it's hard for us to really know what that looked like. We have accounts in literature and so forth. I think one of the best views into this before the age of photography comes from Monet. And Monet, him of Water Lilies fame, came to London 3 or 4 times around 1900. And his trips to London were largely funded by a wealthy benefactor who paid for him to stay in the Savoy. So the pictures that Monet painted, of which there is quite a few, which he does time and time again, he does the same picture about tens of times, but they're all pretty much what I could see from my hotel bedroom window. And remembering our time at King's, from the Savoy, what you do is you look out across Waterloo Bridge onto the South Bank. So that's the area which is now the South Bank, and where FWB was, where we were. So you can see a very different London. And Monet came to London not for the nightlife, not for the culture or anything like that, but he came for the light. So that's that particular interplay, as he described it, of the air pollution as well as the smoggy conditions in the city. So that gives us some idea of what it looked like. But that doesn't tell us about the concentrations. So one of the bravest attempts, I think, to try to trace back through what air pollution concentrations were like over a long time was done in the US, actually not many years ago. They noticed, these researchers noticed that bird specimens that were in natural history collections in museums from polluted times look considerably better than those from fresher times. So the birds, as they were flying around in smoggy air, were collecting the smog on their feathers and becoming discoloured. And what they did was they went and collected the same species from lots of museums over lots of different times, and they managed to backtrack to produce a relative sort of concentration trend. Could you move on to the next slide, please? And this here is, in relative terms, air pollution concentrations across the US from about 1880-ish to nearly to the present day. That's the black line on here. And you can see a number of events, such as you can see the Great Depression causing that dip in the middle, and then a post-war recovery. And then you can see a slow tail off as there are various air pollution acts that control the concentrations. Great about change, but doesn't really tell us about concentrations. Next, please. Now, there's some really interesting work that's been done in going back through sort of atmospheric records. And we'll all be aware of like Benjamin Franklin and his experiments with electricity. And there was a lot of people in the sort of 1800s, pardon me, who were making atmospheric measurements, or measurements mainly associated with weather. But one of the things that a lot of people were measuring was related to the electrical properties of the atmosphere. Sometime later in the 1930s, it was observed by a gentleman called Whipple, who was working at the Kew Observatory, that some of these electrical properties of the atmosphere actually changed in tandem with air pollution. And then sometime later again, this century, a gentleman called Harrison, not the Roy, but Giles Harrison from the University of Reading, decided that he would use this to try to go back to see what air pollution was like using these electrical measurements in the atmosphere. So that gives us some view about what air pollution might have been like in the 1860s. You can see from this diurnal charts that if you look at the dark line, air pollution in London not only showed this interesting diurnal pattern, which you wouldn't necessarily expect, and we can think about why that is the case, but was definitely worse in winter time than it was in London. There's also some other measurements from the 1780s by a gentleman who lived at 10 Parkside in Knightsbridge. And if we sort of mash our way through these, we can find those between about 100 and 200 micrograms per cubic meter. And the ones that are there from Kew are probably somewhere around about 150 micrograms per cubic meter. So that would have been in the top 10 at the moment for PM 2.5, but probably less than what our cyclist in India is experiencing. Next, please. But of course, these aren't proper measurements. In the UK, we have a unique track record of air pollution measurements. The world's very first air pollution network was created here in the UK in 1912. It wasn't actually created by government. It was actually created as a bottom-up response from a voluntary group of local authorities and smoke abatement societies who all got together around an exhibition and conference and decided that the only way they could move forward an air pollution agenda was to actually start to measure it. And there's a copy there of their very first report, which was just before the First World War. Next one, please. So this network began working, and it can still, the measurement network we have in the UK today still owes some of its structure to the work that they did. But an interesting question is, where is all the data from these earlier measurements? And I was really lucky to be able to track down the only copy of all of the measurements that extend from about the First World War up to about 1960, when they're then available online. And this was the last time I saw them sitting on my desk at King's, and I've entrusted them to Ian's hands to place into the King's vaults. But there's page after page of numbers there. And Pam Davey, who hopefully is here, and I have been putting in a little bit of time to actually try to make sense of them. Could I go to the next slide, please? So one of the things they had to do with this network is figure out how to measure air pollution, and they really had no idea. And there was an engineer working with them called John Switzer Owens, and I've no idea how he got connected with them, but he started inventing ways of measuring air pollution. And one of the systems he used is in the image on the left-hand side. And what this is measuring is what we think of as black smoke today. So when we're setting up a measurement site at the moment, we often worry about getting enough power. This machine on the left-hand side was actually water. It needed a mains water supply. So the tank was filled every 10 or 15 minutes, and then it was flushed. And the action of flushing sucked air through that sort of nozzle that sticked out the top to make a sample on a piece of filter paper, and then the system was filled up again, and the whole thing was controlled by clockwork. Those machines carried forward a little bit further, and you can see that some of the last instruments of the type, which we actually operated at Marylebone Road up until about 10 years ago, is contained there in the left-hand panel. Next slide, please. But one of the things that Pam and I have been looking at is how they calibrated these machines, because to be able to construct a data set from these reports over time, we have to know that they had not only good calibration, but consistent calibration. And what they were measuring was black smoke. And what they did was they calibrated their black smoke measurement to gravimetric measurements of PM10 or particles that are in the air. So probably something akin to PM 2.5, because there was a lot of smoke at the time. So Pam has been working away at trying to assemble time series for a few cities in the UK from about the early 1920s up to the 1980s. And we can see some of the concentrations that prevailed at the time. So the top trace is that of Stoke-on-Trent, and which is a heavily industrial place. And if you've been watching the Great Pottery Throwdown, you'll see Stoke-on-Trent and its heritage. And you can see concentrations that are in the 4, 6, 7, 800 micrograms per cubic meter annual mean. So far greater than our Indian cyclist was experiencing. At the bottom, we've got measurements at Q, and you can see that for much of the 20th century, at least the first part of the 20th century, the air pollution that was being experienced in suburban London is clearly similar to what the Indian cyclist was experiencing, or what it experiences on a day-to-day basis. The interesting thing, of course, is to note about how much it's changed as well, and how much that change is not uniform across cities. So whether this opens up opportunities for epidemiology to be able to track progress in different cities and compare and contrast health outputs, I think that would be something really nice to explore. So next, please. One of the other things that is, of course, interesting in this is, did the 1956 Clean Air Act work? And if you read quite a few people's books, there's quite a deal of cynicism about it. But looking into the data in these reports, we can see that clearly it did. What happens is it was implemented it was put into action first in London, and you can see the blue line shows rapid falls in concentrations from about 1956, where we've got annual means of over 300 micrograms per cubic meter, to 15 years later, where we've got concentrations that are less than a third. Whereas if you look at the black line, you can see what was going on in the cities outside London, where the Clean Air Act and smoke control areas were much slower in their implementation. So you can see undoubtedly that it worked, at least as far as cleaning up London's air, and then later in the rest of the country. So next slide, please. So you've got to say, well, that's it. It was all sorted then. We had the Clean Air Act, and, well, of course, no, it wasn't. One of the things that the Clean Air Act did was they focused very much on particle pollution, and they focused on abating that with higher chimneys and, of course, with smokeless coal. They did absolutely nothing for sulfur emissions, and those grew hugely across the whole of Europe, not just the UK, but the whole of Europe for the next couple of decades, which of course gave rise to the acid rain problems and the environmental impacts that were seen across Norway and first identified in the 1970s. Next slide, please. Of course, then we started work on emissions from factories, and underneath the radar, without us really noticing, many other sources have appeared, largely for a long time completely without really any serious regulation. So we had air pollution from traffic, and I put VW there, but other polluting diesels are available. Wood burning has returned to our homes, and I was just reading Will's paper the other day, which highlights, of course, the tyre and brake and road wear, and these things are appearing underneath the policy radar to be problems of the future. Next slide, please. So coming back to the original question, taking my cyclist as he pedals through the thick smog in an Indian town, is this the worst pollution ever? Well, actually, probably not. But if we think about the amount of people that are exposed to it compared to those that were living in cities in the UK in Victorian times, there are probably many hundreds of millions of Indians. I mean, India has a population of about 1 billion, doesn't it? That are living in conditions where they're exceeding PM 2.5 WHO guidelines by perhaps as much as about 20 times. And we know what their future might be without robust actions. And of course, it's not really just about PM. There is a whole different mixture of particles that they will be experiencing compared to London. And there's other pollutants as well, such as ozone, but that's part of another story. So if we just move on to the last slide, I've got some contacts there, and I wanted again to credit Pam for the work that we've been doing together on some of the historic data. And if you're interested in the good book, of course, I'm going to plug mine there. But at the same time, or just after, over a period of about 3 or 4 months, 3 books were all published in the UK around the same sort of time. And there's mine, there's Tim Smedley's Clearing the Air, and of course there's Beth Gardiner's book Choked, and it's a real honour to be sharing a platform with her this afternoon. So I'll stop at that point. Thank you.
Thanks, you very much.
Thanks so much. Go on, Joseph.
No, thank you very much for your great presentation, Gary. We'll park some. We've had some really interesting questions that have been asked in the chat function of the YouTube live. So we'll be sure to ask them to you during our Q&A session at the end. So thank you again for presenting a brilliant presentation.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gary.
So our next speaker, Dylan, who's this?
So we've now got Professor Anna Hansell, who's going to talk about the health impacts of air pollution exposure over the life course and what it means for us. And yeah, just to reiterate what Joseph said there, if you do have any questions, you pop them in the chat box, and we're going to ask all of the speakers at the end in a panel discussion and discuss all the questions that you ask.
Perfect.
So yeah.
Hi, Anna.
Hi there.
Hi, Anna.
Would you mind sharing your screen for us, please?
Yeah, I'll go through the steps on that. Let's figure this one out. Should be here. I did have a slide. There we go. Are we on the screen? Yeah, that's fine.
Perfect.
We can see your screen.
Okay. Well, thanks for inviting me. So I started off at Imperial and did my PhD at Imperial, and I moved to Leicester 3 years ago, but I'm still working with Gary on some air pollution and noise projects. So very interested in the historical presentation that Gary's just done. So thanks for that. Can you see the screen? So on the left-hand side, you should see the picture of the bus in the smog, which is in 1952. That's great. Okay, so I thought this was a good place to pick up from Gary's presentation, 1952 smog. So I think people think that this was a one-off event, and that was it. And then we sorted it out with the Clean Air Act in 1956, and it was fine after that. And the answer is, of course, it wasn't. London probably had lower air pollution levels than some of the cities in the northern part of England. And there were air pollution episodes that were like this, that went on at least up into the early 60s. And that was part of the PhD that I was doing, was looking at some of those historic records. And, you know, the 1952 smog, there's some great descriptions. It was so bad, you'd sit in a cinema, you couldn't actually see the screen. You would walk along and the embankment and fall off into the Thames because you couldn't see where the edge was. So that's how bad the air pollution was. And, you know, it is personal, because talking to my mother about this, she remembers in the sort of 50s and 60s in Norwich, which is not known for high pollution levels, but they would have really bad smogs. And she would have to walk in front of her parents' car with a light to show where the road was, when they got stuck in a smog that was that bad. So it did affect large areas of the UK. So most of the rest of my talk covers a study that was published in Thorax in 2016. So that's on the right-hand side of the screen there, historic air pollution and long-term mortality risks in England and Wales. And one of the comments that I had about this study when I was planning it were, well, why bother? And, you know, that was historic air pollution level. What does it matter? And the answer is it probably does quite a lot, because it may affect your mortality risk across the life course. So that's one thing I wanted to look at in the study. And the second was just looking at China, because China has quite a similar type of air pollution mix, I think, to what we were experiencing in England in the 60s and 70s, where we had a coal burning, lots of coal burning going on, and we also had increasing traffic emissions. So I think the balance of the traffic and coal is going to be different in China, but there's certainly some similarities there. And I've got down the bottom right the picture of the Olympic Stadium. You may remember how bad the air pollution was with the Olympics in Beijing, and the sort of heroic efforts that were taken to try and clean up the air. And they have been cleaning up the air in Beijing, certainly over the last 20 years. But I think the levels now are still, you know, probably around what we were experiencing in the UK in the 50s and 60s, at least for some of the time period. So, you know, that's not the only country in the world that's got similarities. But I think it is worth looking at these historic levels, because, as Gary's pointed out with India as well, there are high air pollution levels in other areas of the world at the moment. So what we did in the UK study, as Gary said, we've got great monitoring data in the UK. And after the 56 Clean Air Act, we had concentration on looking at black smoke as our measure of particulates and sulfur dioxide. So we've got a good network that's available with electronically available data from the 1960s onwards. And we used those data to model what the air pollution levels were on 1 kilometre grids over Great Britain in 60s, 70s, 80s and 90s. And then we had to change metric, because the metric that was measured changed from black smoke to PM10. And that was sort of the 90s and early 2000s. And then beyond that, we've tended to concentrate on PM2.5 as well as PM10. So if you're an epidemiologist like I am, that gives you a bit of a headache, because your metrics are changing over time, and you don't always have the ability to think about how to compare them. There's not always an easy ratio between the two. So black smoke itself is when you draw smoke through a white filter paper, and you see how black it is, and you calibrate it against how black it would get with coal smoke. So Gary, Ian, correct me if I'm wrong on the technical details on this, but that's my sort of general overview of what it's like. So it's great if you're measuring coal burning. If you're measuring petrol vehicles in the sort of 80s plus a bit of coal burning, it becomes less good as a measure of particulates, because what's coming out of the car is less black. When you get more diesel, into the fleet, then the particles blacker, and it will might affect your measure of black smoke because they're darker on the filter paper. And the other thing you've got to think about is the sulfur dioxide measures that we also modelled over the time period, and they're actually a measure of acidity in the air. So they will be picking up some NO2 from traffic in our later decades that we're looking at. What I've got here is the air pollution exposures in 1971 and the SO2 levels in 1971. You can see the cities show up very clearly on this. We used a method called land use regression to do the models for this. We looked at doing dispersion modelling, but we didn't have enough detailed information on the sources to be able to make that work. So we've used land use regression. Happy to pick up questions on that. And for this particular study, we modelled air pollution in 1971, 1981 and 1991 using black smoke and SO2, and we modelled, we had a model for PM10, which was for 2001, and we related those to a 1% sample of the national census who'd been followed up since 1971. So the census is every 10 years. We could know where they lived in 71, 81, 91, 2001, and we could assign an air pollution concentration to that. So census, the 2021 census is on Sunday, so please fill in your forms, because that means that someone can do an air pollution study in 50 years' time using your data. So I think that's a great motivation for filling in your census forms. So we then looked at what the risk of mortality was for the people who had been present in 1971 and stayed in Great Britain over that time period. And we followed them up for a 38-year period. And we did an analysis looking at what you were exposed to in 1971 and then your death in the subsequent decades. And we analysed it specifically like that because we wanted to see whether there were changes by decades when we knew that there were changes in sources over time. So this graph is showing you the risk of mortality. So that's the odds ratio here. So 1.2 is a 20% increased risk. And then we've got the mortality in sort of 10-year chunks. This is black smoke in 1971 related in the box here on the left-hand side related to mortality in 1982 to 91. And then we've got another little section here, which is your black smoke in 1971 in the box related to what your risk of dying in 1992 to 2001, and then in the final one it's black smoke in 1971, and then your risk of mortality in 2002 to 9. So just looking at that, you can see that what you're exposed to in 71 still increased your risk of death in 2002 to 9. So that's over 30 years later, you could still detect an effect, and it was still there if we adjusted for the past years of exposure. So this is the same graph, but it's highlighting something different. So you concentrate on the right hand side, deaths in 2002 to 2009, and what you were exposed to back in time in 1971 gave you a small increased risk of dying. What you were exposed to in 2001, so quite recently, gave you a much higher risk of mortality per unit exposure. So you could just say they're measuring different things, and that's what the difference is. But you do see this with, even if you use the same metrics. So black smoke, more recent exposures have a higher exposure response coefficient than back in time. And that may be because what you're exposed to back in the past isn't as important as what you're exposed to more recently, which would be quite plausible. Or it may be because the sources have changed over time, and what we're breathing now may be more toxic, even though there's lower levels of it. So there's two possible hypotheses. There are other explanations for this as well that we went into in the paper. So that's really quite interesting. And I finally just wanted to stop on just the media interpretation of the study. So it was really interesting going through the whole sort of media process of this. We gave a press conference on the results. And we thought, what you're exposed to in the past still affecting you nowadays, but it's really important to reduce air pollution. And we found in this press conference that one of the journalists had a particular concern about the school run and four-wheel drives in London, and sort of shifted the conversation onto heavy vehicles and brake and tyre wear, which we were not really expecting to be answering questions of. So it was it was an interesting process. But it was also sort of driven by what the questions were around at the time of what was pulled out of the study and what was reported in the press. So again, very happy to take discussion on that, because I think it's also interesting how things get reported. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing now. Hopefully I didn't run over too much.
No, not at all. That was fantastic.
No, not at all. Thanks, Anna.
Great, thanks.
Perfect. So now we understand that there's a historical exposure of air pollution, and we've found out the influence of that to our health based on a population basis. So, do you know what's next?
What's next? So now Ian's going to talk to us about maybe what we don't know, what we have less information about, and maybe more on what.
Please continue.
No, go on. What was you going to say?
I was just merely going to make a joke about Ian being an oracle and knowing what everyone else doesn't know.
What everyone doesn't know. We'll see.
Okay, Ian, it's over to you if you're ready to present your slides. Ian, you're on mute, so I'll take you off mute just quickly. Oh, I can't unmute you, unfortunately.
Can you see my slides now?
I can see your browser. If you just reshare, if you move your browser away and then...
I'll try sharing again. Just give me 1 second. It's being temperamental. As always, this is the way of the world.
What I can do is, if you're happy for me to present them.
Why don't you present them? Because for some reason, I've got it open on my screen, but it's not appearing in the application window, which is very boring for everybody. So if you show my slides, that'd be great. And I'll tell you to advance them at the least appropriate moments. How does that sound?
If I go into presenter mode, you'll just have to tell me when to stop, okay?
Yeah, absolutely. So look, everyone, I'm not sure if I'm going to do exactly what Joseph told me to do, because he gave me this title, and the title is The Toxicity of Air Pollution and Its Impacts on Human Health. And I'm going to kind of take it as read that this audience knows a little bit about the health impacts of air pollution. I'm even going to take it as read that you're all up to speed on the links with dementia and mental health, birth outcomes. And there are all these new associations which are being made between air pollution and health. But the issue here is that I was given a title, and the title has the word toxicity in it, and I'm a toxicologist, and that allows me to just get onto one of my pet topics, which is, why are we still using PM 2.5 and PM 10 as metrics to interrogate population level health? Now, I know it's available data, but it's sort of hiding away from the reality of the chemical complexity and heterogeneity of materials within the air. And part of my focus on this has been stimulated. You'll see there's a kind of like a diagonal quote across my slide here. And it's actually a quote which was made to me at a governmental meeting by one of the world's leading epidemiologists, who said, "Toxicology really doesn't add anything significant to the discussions of the health impacts of air pollution." And you'll see I've said a very famous unnamed epidemiologist, because that's now how you make accusations. You make them, but you don't say who did it. So the reality is that there's this feeling that toxicology isn't really useful. And I want to make a case that that's not true. And that if we really want to understand the chemical complexity of air pollution and how it actually triggers a range of different disease outcomes, we have to understand and use the tools of toxicity to begin to understand the fundamental mechanisms leading us from the air we breathe to the adverse health effects we see in the population, be those short-term health effects or be those chronic health effects. And I also want to make a claim that toxicology is really where it all started. It didn't start with the London smog. It didn't start with statistical associations, because people had been studying particles and the impact of particles on health for centuries before this, but within the occupational field. And so I thought I might get out historied by Gary. And so I'm going to go forward one slide and just push back the envelope of time a little bit here. Go to the next slide, Joseph.
Sorry, has my screen frozen?
Your screen has frozen.
No,
it's still there. Yeah. So here we have Philippus, hideous, impronounceable name, von Hockenheim, otherwise known as Paracelsus. Paracelsus is often described as being the father of toxicology. And he was a very radical thinker, and bizarrely, one of his most fundamental treatises is a sort of documentation which is called the Health of Miners and the Sicknesses of Miners, essentially. It was published somewhere between 1533 and 34, whilst he was actually acting as a physician in the Tyrol region of Austria. And he was investigating the health effects that were being observed, especially the short life expectancies and excess mortality of miners working within that area. And he did lots of work and was able to make the observations that it was something about the air they were breathing, and particularly the risks of premature mortality were greater in individuals who were involved in, if you like, metal work, sort of metal smelting from the ores which were being mined from that area. Now, this is, I would argue, the first piece of modern toxicology, and it's actually the first piece of particle occupational health. So this is where it all begins. And Paracelsus is famous for a number of really, really important issues. For a start, he made the observation, which is very unpopular at the time, that effects could be organ-specific in relation to particular chemicals. He introduced the concept of the importance of dose, and he made the observation that it's the dose of something which determines whether it has an adverse or beneficial effect. The dose makes the poison, his famous comment. He also argued that disease had a chemical basis. And for this assumption that chemistry should be part of medicine, he was widely pilloried and disassociated from the medical community of the time. They didn't like his quantitative approaches. They didn't like the idea of chemistry invading, if you like, their academic area. But importantly, the other thing which he highlighted was the potential toxicity of metals. And when you read through this early treatise, what's interesting is there are conversations that not all particles are equal. Certain particles have more toxicity than other particles. Certain roles within a mining setting are more hazardous to health than other roles within the mining setting. This is completely applicable, I would argue, to the issues we have with air pollution now. But there's something else which comes from this, and it's something which was stimulated by the recent obsession I've seen in the literature with measuring black carbon. Now, measuring black carbon is a really good way of getting a proxy signal of combustion, especially from diesel vehicles in busy urban centres. But somehow, on the journey of showing that black carbon measurements are associated with adverse health effects, people have begun to believe that somehow elemental carbon is toxic. And I would argue that if it has toxicity, it's really low, and that you would have to have a really high dose of black carbon for it to elicit harmful effects on the tissue. But rather than just saying that, I can give you some illustrations of the point. So if we go to the next slide, I make no apologies for showing you some pathology here. It will take a second, I think, if Joseph can move forward. On the left-hand side here, we have a pathological sample, a whole lung section taken from a miner who's got coal miner's pneumoconiosis, or black lung. And you can see the surface of the lung is highly discolored. It's covered with what seems to be particulate carbon particles. And these particles are submicron. They are what we would classify as being PM2.5 when you look at them histologically within the lung tissue. Now, unfortunately, the animations aren't working here. But if the next two sections were really showing, no, don't worry about it. If we go to the very top band on the right-hand side, this is a section taken from the lung of this individual. This is brilliant, Joseph. Well done. That's great improvisation. And this is actually a section taken from this lung. And what you can see is these black accumulations. And these are macrophages within the lung, which are absolutely packed full of black carbon. And they have grouped together within the achene of the alveolus and within the tissues, and they become essentially senescent. They are very mildly inflammatory. They release very low levels of pro-inflammatory cytokines. And in these lungs, despite the way they look, despite their blackness, the only really thing you see is a really kind of mild airway enlargement and alveolar enlargement. This is a very mild emphysemic response. Now, that's not to say that working in a mine and breathing coal dust isn't bad for you, but it's the components within the coal dust which matters. Here, we have a coal dust which is very pure elemental carbon. And then if we go to the other side, we see again on the bottom right-hand side, a lung section, exactly this one, taken from an individual where they're breathing coal dust, same size, but this coal dust has a high silicon content. And associated with it, you'll see these big consolidated pink areas, almost like stratifications within the airways. And this is scar tissue. So here we have collagen deposition and massive sort of fibrosis within the airway. Now, this is when coal miners' pneumoconiosis becomes serious. And it's not serious because of the coal dust per se, because that has a very mild effect, even at very, very high concentrations. But the silicon associated with it is highly cytotoxic. And in fact, that you can see similar sort of pathology if you look at iron-rich coal ores from miners in Peru, for example. So this is saying that carbon on its own has an effect, it's quite mild, but other stuff associated with it is what is really giving its toxicity. And for me, this is important when we have discussions about associations with pollutant metrics. Black carbon is telling us something, it's telling us about the source. But the carbon itself probably isn't the causal component. It's not the thing which is driving the adverse health effects. And somehow in the literature, people have run away with making all sorts of observations about black carbon without reflecting on what is known from the occupational literature. And I've just encouraged people to draw back to what is known in the occupational field. The next slide, please. Now, again, I was concerned that obviously Gary might come in with John Evelyn. And so I thought I'd go even further back. And so this is, and you know, we're talking about particularly interesting history. So I thought I'd go all the way back. This is a section of the Elbers Papyrus, which is an Egyptian, if you like, well, a sort of medical document. It was actually bought at a bazaar, I think, in about the mid-19th century for peanuts by a sort of like German Egyptologist. It's now held in Germany in a museum. But this copy dates from 1500 BC, and it's taken that this is a copy of an earlier document, and the earlier document comes from probably around 3400 BC. So we've got a good 5,000 years of history here to consider back. Now, this is interesting because within this document, we have references, always inferred references to diseases we worry about now in relation to air pollution. So it talks about dementia, asthma, depression, you know, a whole host of things, even sort of cancers. But what I really like about this document is it talks about poisons, and it's one of the earliest documents where people talk about poisons and dose. And within that discussions of poisons, it talks about the risk to the health of metal workers who are working with lead, antimony, and copper, and related to that, the use of particularly antimony as a poison. Now, I've put these in here purely because this is a very old document. It's highlighting chemicals, chemical elements as being harmful components. And if we look at lead, well, you can still get lead enrichments at roadside sites, and people can argue about where that lead comes from. And antimony and copper, well, look, there we have brake dust. Brake dust signatures sitting there in clear sight, albeit from a piece of literature dating back 5,000 years. So I thought it was interesting just to reflect on this. And again, this story that metals may be important, and we maybe have stopped considering the importance of metals in air pollution. In the early days, in the late 1980s, metals were quite a thing in terms of the air pollution literature, but they sort of disappeared, and people have studied them less in recent time. We can go to the next slide. So I've tried to keep this simple because I wanted to leave you a very simple message, and that's that I don't think I can scientifically justify the concept that all particles within any size fraction, PM10, PM2.5, ultrafines, are equally toxic. I also struggle with the concept that you can simply classify the toxicity of particles based on their shape and size. That, to me, feels as though it's overly simplistic and is throwing away every piece of chemical knowledge since the Renaissance. But I'd also say that it's quite true that current methods which have interrogated health effects within the population have found it very difficult to identify if there's a component part of PM2.5, for example, which is more harmful than others. But if that is the case, I think you have to explain how that can be the case, that materials which are compositionally so very different can elicit similar responses, and that particle mass as a metric can be equally as informative to a whole range of diseases which have different disease pathways, different, if you like, etiological sort of mechanisms, different rates and different sort of mechanisms of exacerbation. How can it all simply be related back to PM2.5 mass? And I think in the previous talk, Anna intimated this, that we may be in a situation in the contemporary airshed that we have lower concentrations of PM, but we may actually have an altered chemistry which makes them more toxic on a per unit mass basis. But without toxicology delving into that question, there will never be a resolution to this simple question. And we will never be able to identify which are the most harmful component parts of PM2.5. And if we can't do that, our policies to reduce air pollution, to protect human health, will be at best blunt. Thank you. That's it.
We can't hear you there, Joseph.
Apologies for the...
No. Go on, man.
Apologies for the sharing of the presentation issues or the technical issues. That was a great presentation. Sorry, Dylan, over to you.
I was very happy with your moving of the slides. It was very good, Joseph.
It was a bit of improvisation, if I'm honest with you.
Thanks so much, Ian. Thank you. So our next speaker is Beth Gardiner. Beth's a environmental journalist and the author of this book here, Choked: The Age of Air Pollution and the Fight for a Cleaner Future. And Beth's going to give her perspective, or a perspective from outside of the centre and outside of what we usually do, on people's exposure to air pollution, the health impacts and policy, and yeah, from her perspective, or a journalistic perspective. So thank you. Over to you, Beth.
Okay, great. Hi, it's so nice to be with you guys today. Thank you very much for having me. As the only non-academic and the only journalist on this panel, maybe it was sort of inevitable that I'm the only one without a slide presentation and any screen sharing. So you're just going to have to look at my face through this talk. And I'm also, I guess, a little bit less data-based and a little bit more sort of maybe anecdotal, you could say, or also sort of policy-based. And I was asked to address the issue of how we can address air pollution, how we can clean it up and start to reduce it and fix this problem, or continue the process of doing that. And I just wanted to start with a little bit of a focus on why that's so important. I know Ian said just now that he was taking it as read that everyone at this event today is pretty familiar with the health impacts of air pollution. And I'm sure that's true, but I'm just going to sort of rehearse them a little bit, because as a layperson, when I first started coming to this issue, not from a scientific background of like all the others, I was really shocked to learn what I had been breathing all this time. I've lived in London for about 20 years. I was in New York before this. when I first arrived here, I really noticed a lot, just sort of walking down the street, this kind of smell of exhaust and fumes in the air, and a kind of thickness to the air that I was breathing that I hadn't experienced at all in New York. And the reason I'm telling you that is that, I think my own sort of, experience of this problem and coming to understand it really helped me to see some of the failures that have led not just London and not just the UK, but really all of Europe into, the pretty significant mess that we are in right now when it comes to air quality. And as I think it's important to understand those failures and understand how we've gotten to where we are in order to think about solutions and going forward. And in terms of why it matters, as I said, I was pretty shocked when I first started to read some of the science on this and to see the, really strong evidence linking elevated rates of air pollution to increased rates of such a long list of health problems, all the way from heart attacks and strokes and dementia and multiple kinds of cancer, through to, research today on connections with diabetes and obesity and mental health and all kinds of problems that I would have never, intuitively as a layperson connected to air pollution. And I think the thing that is so critical here is the understanding that actually when air pollution starts to come down, when you take the policy steps to get the air even incrementally cleaner, a little bit better year on year, you reap the health benefits almost immediately. I mean, those benefits are long lasting, and Anna was telling us, you will sort of feel them cumulatively over your lifespan. But it is also true that, when pollution rates are high, particularly PM 2.5 and the ultrafine particles, you will see heart attacks and strokes and hospital admissions going up almost immediately. And the inverse is true as well, that when those levels come down and the air gets cleaner, you reap the benefits almost immediately in terms of fewer hospitalizations and, better health across the population. So, that's sort of just a little bit of perspective, I think, on why this matters. As I said, when I first moved here from New York, I didn't really understand it, but I could sort of feel it when I walked down the street, this, almost a little bit of a headache that I would get, a little bit of a lightheadedness just walking down even, a slightly busy road, not necessarily only the heaviest trafficked, most heavily trafficked areas. And it wasn't something that seemed to be sort of on the media radar screen at all. It wasn't something that I heard anyone really talking about. I had this vague awareness of, the great smogs of many decades earlier. So I just sort of pushed it to the back of my mind. I figured it, it must have just been my imagination, kind of this oversensitive American. And it was many years later in the course of researching another story, that a story to do with the start of the Olympics in 2012 and how air quality might impact the athletes, that I started to read a little bit of that science and kind of understand, how powerful this was and how significantly it was affecting those of us who, live here and breathe this air over the course of many years. And what I struggled to understand for a long time was why London's air felt so much worse to me than New York's did. Not even talking about sort of measurements, which are in fact significantly worse. The air in London and all across the UK and Europe is quite a lot worse than it was back home in New York and across the US. Now, being an American, coming to the UK, coming to Europe, we are certainly not used to thinking of ourselves as being kind of out ahead of the curve in any way, environmentally, compared to Europe. And generally speaking, that is true. In most other areas, whether it's climate change or regulation of chemicals, Europe and the UK are, far more progressive and far more aggressive than the US is. But what I started to learn as I delved into this is that actually on air quality, the American story has been one of a relative success. And in fact, the U.S. is, as I said, quite a lot, benefits from quite a lot better air quality than Britain and Europe does. And it was with this in mind that I sort of came to understand what happened in 2015 when we started to hear about the Dieselgate scandal, in which Volkswagen was cheating and producing and selling cars that were emitting many times over the legal limit of nitrogen dioxide. And I think that the way that played out is pretty instructive. VW was selling cars with defeat devices in them that allowed the vehicles to detect when tests were being run and shut off the pollution controls while regulators were checking them, versus being out on the road when they were emitting way over the legal limit. So it's really the most flagrant sort of rule breaking that you could imagine. Now, in the US, where diesels are far less popular and there were many fewer of them on the roads, about 600,000, the US authorities forced the company to pay billions of dollars to fix the problem, to buy back cheating cars from people who had bought them, to upgrade them, and to get them either off the roads or into compliance. In Europe, where it's now almost 6 years on from this scandal coming to light, there are still, it's estimated, about 11 million diesels on the roads that are emitting 3 or more times the legal limit of nitrogen dioxide. It's about 11 million in the UK, 51 million across Europe. So it really speaks to, I think, something much bigger than the sort of preference in Europe and the UK for so many years for diesel over petrol. Diesel, as we know, is a more polluting fuel, harder to make those cars run cleaner and more expensive to make them run cleaner. But to me, what the sort of ongoing legacy of this scandal speaks to, and the fact that what these companies, because it turned out that it was not just Volkswagen, but nearly the entire industry of major car manufacturers selling diesels that were in one way or another, pretty flagrantly bending and breaking the rules, demonstrated that there was a real failure in enforcement, because the authorities allowed the companies to get away with this cheating, and in fact are still allowing them to sell cars that are emitting way more than the legal limit of nitrogen dioxide. And I think that when you hear sort of solutions discussed now, there's a tremendous amount of focus on sort of local efforts, whether it's London and the ultra low emission zone, charging the oldest, most polluting diesels if they want to come into central London, or similar schemes across the UK and Europe. I think what we've sort of ended up with is this patchwork approach, where it is left to individual cities, regions, even sometimes neighborhoods, when you hear about sort of school streets or low pollution zones where cars are kept out of certain areas at certain times of day. We've sort of fallen into this approach of trying to control where these incredibly polluting vehicles are going, rather than actually, at a much higher level of government, requiring the cars to comply with the law. And I think that, these sort of more local efforts are certainly very understandable, and they can make a significant difference in terms of bringing better air quality to a particular city, a particular neighborhood, what have you. But we've sort of fallen into this because of the failures, at the much higher level. Obviously, no mayor, whether it's Sadiq Khan or anyone else, has the power to force a multinational company like a Volkswagen or BMW to get their cars into compliance with the law. And it's that failure by national governments, whether it's the UK or other governments across Europe, that has left us in a position where mayors and local councils are forced to sort of try to say, okay, you can't bring this particular car into this particular area. And we've really failed, I think, to address this problem at the root. And it is that sort of incredibly porous system of enforcement, I think, that is what has left Europe and the UK with air pollution that, as I said, is significantly worse than in the US, where the enforcement apparatus has been more centralized within the Environmental Protection Agency, sort of speaking historically over the past 50 years, not the last 4, when we've seen obviously a lot of backsliding under the Trump administration. But historically speaking, the US has built a much more effective enforcement mechanism with an EPA that is much better resourced, and both sort of with expertise, with equipment to sort of do its own tinkering, own experimentation on what kinds of engine configurations and other things can make cars run a little bit cleaner. And they've had the legal muscle to force polluting industries, whether it's the auto industry or any other industry, to get them to get into compliance and stay in compliance with the law. So it's that contrast that has been really instructive, I think, and that has left Europe with a pretty significant mess. Obviously, looking forward, we need to be thinking about a shift away from internal combustion engines altogether, and towards whether it's electric cars, a reduction in the number of cars, better public transport, and ability for people to cycle and walk more safely and more easily in our cities. Obviously those things are all incredibly important as we look to the future. But I think it's really also important to understand that even in the existing fossil fuel economy as we live with it today, the failures to properly enforce existing laws and regulations as they are written on paper and to make them mean something in the real world is why we are where we are right now. So I think I'm going to end it there, and we'll look forward to going a little deeper in some of the Q&A afterwards.
Perfect. Thank you very much for your presentation. And I know it's obviously very difficult sometimes to present without slides, so you've done incredibly well. So thank you very much, Beth.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
So from the Amber's Papyrus all the way through to John Evelyn to Dieselgate, I think we've really tried to summarize 5,000 years of air pollution. I don't know whether we've done very well, but what do you think, Dylan?
I thought it was brilliant. I thought it was great. And we're now going to move on to the panel discussion, aren't we? And we've got loads of questions for the speakers to answer.
Yeah,
from the audience.
So if anyone that is viewing and would like to ask a question, now's the time to type it into the Q&A. What we'll do is we'll spotlight the question in the YouTube in the live function now, and we'll bring the speakers back into the main share in the main broadcast rather, to discuss the questions. So without further ado, the speakers will be now reintroduced to the broadcast. Perfect. So that's everyone. Hello, everyone again. I thought, there's no better place to start than Annalise Shiernan's question that I've just flagged up. Sorry about that. She's asked multiple questions, it seems, and it's not that warm. It's this one. It's been great to learn how our knowledge of air pollution has grown over the past 5,000 years. Considering the vast wealth of knowledge, why is air pollution still such an issue? And what can we do to speed up improvements? The floor is yours. Gary, please.
Yeah, we need a code on this, don't we? I'll be happy to have a punt at this. I think one of the it's a good question. We talk about the 1952 smog, and 70, 80 oddly years later, we're still dealing with air pollution. So why haven't we succeeded? And I think time after time, the main area of failure is that we frame it too narrowly. So 1952, we tackled the smoke problem, but we ignored the sulfur dioxide. That then gave rise to the acid rain problems of the 1970s and 80s. We then focused on cleaning up industry, and then beneath the radar, as I was saying in my presentation, things like transport came along. And so we focused on them. We missed the fact that wood burning is coming along. We have to deal with agriculture and everything else. So what we do is we focus, perhaps maybe politicians can only handle so much of the problem, and the public at the same time. We focus on one source very narrowly, rather than trying to think of our air as a resource that we should not be using as a dustbin and as a route to just simply dispose of our waste. We need to be thinking about all of the things we put into the air, and only by doing that are we really going to make any progress.
Joseph, sorry, Anna, do you want to go ahead?
Thanks. Yeah, no, I want to have a punt as well on this. Gary's focused quite technically, but I think there's a lot of politics and economic interests in this. And it's, if you look at many of the different environmental exposures or anything people making lots of money out of, like tobacco smoking, for example, there's a huge sort of pushback. It takes decades to get something through, even when the science seems to be quite clear. And I think we've had a great example last year where we had the scientists saying something about COVID and the politicians, not being as fast to act on the science as maybe we think they could be, but they're also thinking about the economic implications. So I think there's a sort of very recent example on that we could spend the rest of this time discussing, but let's not. But on the air pollution side, I think we have made progress. So over the time period that my study was going on, the air pollution levels had fallen by about threefold. So I think if people say, the air pollution's bad now, but you could say it has been really bad. So we have made progress on this. So it's good not to lose sight of it. And the other comment I want to make is that 52 smog, I think that to get action, it really helps if you have an environmental crisis that is right on top of Parliament and also where all the media companies are. And then, you get loads of coverage of it, and the politicians, they've got risk of walking into the Thames if they go out of the House of Commons. Really focuses the mind.
Yeah, certainly Stoke-on-Trent, if you look at the measurements there, it was, a filthy place for a very long time, and there was no action taken.
Yeah, just to add to what Anna was saying, certainly I think there are, hugely wealthy and powerful interests that are oftentimes opposed to environmental regulation and that make it very hard to move forward. And I think in particular with air pollution, there's a political dynamic around it that is it often makes it difficult to make progress. And that is that, when you clean up the air, the benefits to public health are absolutely massive. But in the same way that the problem can sometimes be invisible, we don't see the pollution in the air, or we don't see the sort of connection on an individual basis that this is making us sick and increasing the number of deaths and all of that. The flip side is that we don't really see the benefits on a personal level when air is cleaned up. These benefits are spread over millions of people over many years. It's sort of an abstraction to say there's going to be X, number of fewer heart attacks or strokes or what have you, because the air is this much cleaner because of, some regulation or law that most people have probably never heard of. So there's kind of not like a political benefit for a politician or regulator or whatever to stand up and actually take the action that's needed. And on the other side, there is a big cost, and the people who are going to pay the cost, which is usually, an industry of one sort or another, whether it's a car company or an oil company or, an agricultural concern, those companies know exactly what it's going to cost them if there is some new regulation put on them, and they don't want to pay it. And they're often pretty, well-connected and powerful and able to make their voices heard. So there's that really strong dynamic that pushes against action versus a sort of much harder to, I guess, feel for politicians to feel push in favor of it.
Ian, would you like to comment? Unfortunately, Ian, you're on mute. Let's say again.
I've had to.
There we go.
My mic's gone completely crazy, so I took it off and on. I was just saying I agree with Beth, but there is the challenge that the public awareness isn't on the same scale as the political cycle. That's a huge problem, and I worry. I think we still get lost in this concept that people don't get air pollution because they can't see it. Well, they can't see viruses ever. Guess what? They've worked that one out for themselves. Yes. The real issue is that most of the burden of air pollution is long term, which means that the actual health effects are displaced in time. It's the time displacement which is the problem. And it's the same problem we had with cigarette smoking. People can smoke when they're young, and they don't reflect on the long-term consequences of smoking on their health, because we as a society don't reflect and don't like to reflect on the final third of our lives. And because we don't do that, we don't really think about the quality of our lives as we, hit retirement age. And that's something we've got to change in our society. So our society understands what we're trying to do here is to preserve health into the future, not just health now. They can understand asthma attacks. They can understand, symptoms and short-term effects. They really struggle, I think, when you begin to talk about long-term accumulative effects across the population.
Mm-hmm.
Is the language and the things that we say as scientists also partly to blame? So, for instance, our stock in trade is to ask for more research. And, there's once I appeared before a GLA assembly, and they actually asked me as the opening question that when would I expect we would have enough evidence to be able to justify action on air pollution? And I was just really surprised by this because, I see an overwhelming abundance of evidence, but there are uncertainties around it. True, that's part of the language of science. And also there's unanswered questions. So maybe we as scientists need to be talking more about what we do know rather than what we want to learn in the future.
Gary, I think the point you just made is a really good one, especially the use of the word uncertainty. Yeah. Now, we use it the whole time scientifically, but very often scientists use it when they're speaking to the media. And if you say to the public, we've shown an association, but there are uncertainties, the public go, oh, it's not true then. I'd much rather that people stood up and said, we're 75% certain, we're 80% certain, we're 65% certain, rather than focusing on using a terminology and language, which I think the public don't quite understand how it's being used. And it becomes very easy for them to go, well, it's not true.
Mm-hmm.
With what I believe to be no one else offering another opinion on this, I'm going to move on to the next question unless anyone else has another opinion. So I'll go to Lauren Ferguson's question, which is there any scope within the data, which, Gary, I believe this is in reference to the air pollution data that you have situated on your old King's desk, the photo that you referred to in your presentation, and within the data to study the health impacts from historical air pollution concentrations, start of the 20th century, and can they be matched with health records from that time? So to Gary and probably Anna.
Yeah, I think it's probably one that I'm going to defer to Anna. But yeah, very much we would like to use this huge paper database to see what we can learn from it. And I think as someone pointed out earlier, I think it was Anna pointed out, there's huge relevance in terms of the control of coal combustion that happened in London through the 1950s, the situation that's found in other countries. And you only have to look as far as Poland within Europe to see that. As for the availability of health information going back, certainly there is plenty. And, Anna's shown that it's been possible to do a study from the 1960s onwards, and that's taught us a lot. But I think a lot of the evidence on air pollution, 1952 smog taught us that peak, acute air pollution events were harmful. Then through the 80s and 90s, we learned that it was the sort of decadal long exposure. And now from the work that Ian's done and others, for instance, the school kids in East London, we are starting to transfer this thinking to say that the exposures you might have in early life might affect you for the rest of your time. And the only way we're really going to understand that, we can't start now and wait 80 odd years to understand that. What we're going to have to do is look backwards. We're going to have to look at the people who are old today and think about the exposures that they might have had in childhood. And the only way to do that is to go back through these historic data. But over to you, Anna. I think you'll be able to give a much better answer than me. Setting you up, of course.
Yeah, the first bit's optimistic because it's great to have these data going back in time. And it would be fantastic to try and use them because we have got very long-running cohorts in the UK, and we've also got mortality data going back to 1841. And part of my PhD was going to vaults, looking up data that was going back to I think I went back about 100 years on the mortality data. The cohorts, we have got some that started around the sort of 1930s. And I have done some work with the 1946 birth cohort. And the problem is that the air pollution measures haven't been that great with the data that we had at the time from, say, 46 up until that 1961 period. And if your model's not that good, it's very hard to detect an impact if you're looking for something that's only a few percent. So, typically your environmental exposures might increase your risk by, 5%, 10% or something, looking at the exposure range. So you need an exposure range, and you need some measure that's going to give you a reasonably accurate sort of idea of where people sit in the range. It doesn't necessarily have to be the exact measure, but in the right sort of ballpark with the range. So some of the studies that have looked back in time have not had great models, and they've struggled to find effects, or they found no effects. So it's definitely worth doing, but it can be quite problematic. And one of the other problems that we've got is sort of looking at when the metrics change over time, and also when the sources change over time. So even if the metrics are the same, what you're actually measuring is something a bit different because they've got different chemical constituents, which is what Ian pulled out. So it's not easy, but if you've got the data, an epidemiologist will try and do something with it. That's
so I think just filling in on that, what's sitting in those cardboard boxes is a data set that hasn't been mined before. And apart from sitting there in a library, it hasn't really had much publicity or access to the outside world. And Pam and I did a lot of work on the metrics, and we found exactly the same calibration route from when they first started in the 19-teens devising these up to the 1960s. And we developed a conversion mechanism that would go from the 1960s through onwards from there. So that was our starting point as measurement scientists, to actually look into this rather than look at the data. We looked at how the measurements were made. Yeah. So I think there's a good opportunity there.
Let's talk. The 46 cohort, I'll just add something about the 46 cohort, because there's a couple of points on that. So I had a PhD student who wrote the thesis and it never made it into papers. So if you're doing your PhD, please try and make sure you get some papers out. But we did have issues with it. So part of it was to do with exposure measures, and the other part was there was about 3,000 people that we could follow over time, and we found that the people dropping out were more likely to be living in the deprived areas with the higher air pollution exposure, and that also gave a problem about detecting effects, because we were losing the people who were most likely to be affected, and then it became quite difficult with your sort of survivor population who were more higher socioeconomic status, who had lower exposure, but were still in your study.
I would like to ask a question, and maybe Dylan would know a lot more about this in terms of dropout, given his PhD's on cohort study. But Dylan, do you have any questions about dropout and whether and how that may influence the bias or the reported findings?
How do you mean? You mean dropout in cohort studies?
Yeah.
In what way? That may affect what we find. I think Anna's better placed to answer that than me. I've only ever worked on one cohort, so.
Well, maybe I'll pass the question over to Anna.
Yeah, I mean, it just will make an effect harder to detect. So it's a bias. It's a well-known bias in cohort studies, and it's just something you can try and evaluate it and try and adjust for it, but or not. Well, you can't really adjust for bias, but you can try and shape your analysis to take account of it. But sometimes it is really difficult. Particularly in the very long-running studies, and if they're quite small to deal with. Like it's sometimes called the healthy cohort effect, and sort of analogous to a healthy worker effect.
Anna, can I ask you a quick question? If we're going back using old cohorts, are we actually going to end up studying the impact of air pollution on middle-class white men? I mean, how representative are they as we go back? I mean, is there a risk that it's going to be a bit like the bias we have in medicine at the moment, where we're finding out things for only a small section of the population?
Well, I think I'd probably middle class older women rather than men.
Okay.
But that's the flippant remark. But you can still see things. So if you think about, most of our information about smoking comes from the British doctors cohort. So they're male, generally speaking, male middle class people who've been exposed and followed up over a long period of time. So even so, I think that probably underestimates the impact of smoking on the general population, because these people are likely to lead a healthier lifestyle, and they certainly gave up smoking quicker than the rest of the population when they found out about the health risks. But we've still got a wealth of information from it, so I wouldn't dismiss it. And you can still find something, but you can then you don't have to think about the generalizability of those estimates. I think the smoking was probably a bit easier because the exposure response, the risks are higher than they are with air pollution, so they tend to be of a smaller magnitude, and therefore they're harder to detect amongst all the other sort of noise that you have to deal with when you're doing an epidemiological study.
So I suppose just moving on to the next question that's been asked, maybe Beth, you could give us your thoughts on this question by Tom Wiggers. I've been told that air quality is improving, but see no quantitative statistical analysis. What methods would you suggest to calculate the trends in levels of atmospheric pollutants? Maybe this is too much of a specific.
Yeah, I think that's a little bit outside of my zone. I would
maybe
kick it to one of the scientists.
Maybe this one's a little bit better. My local authority, apologies for that, does not measure PM 2.5 particulates at all, and measures PM10 at just one of its 50 monitoring sites. Is there any justification for this?
I mean, again, probably Gary or one of the others would be better to answer that than me. But as a layperson who's sort of informed about this, yeah, if they're not measuring PM 2.5, that's a big problem, because PM 2.5 is powerfully linked with a lot of the most significant health effects. So I would be pretty worried about that. Maybe they're focused more on the nitrogen dioxide, which is what's associated with the diesel and traffic emissions that a lot of local authorities might be focused on. But if they're not looking at PM 2.5, they are missing a big picture. And they're also missing the impact of another really important pollution source in a growing one, which is wood burning, which we know is becoming really problematic and starting to erase some of the gains that have been made as traffic regulation on traffic sources are getting tighter. So yeah, I think that's a really important piece of the puzzle. And if the local authority is not measuring it, they're not seeing a good picture, a clear picture.
Yeah, Gary, please.
Yeah, I was just going to add on that. The reason why local authorities, I suppose, are less interested in PM than they are NO2 is, of course, that when setting laws within Europe, we decided to adopt the WHO guidelines for NO2, but yet all our PM limits are way above this. They're way more relaxed. And as Beth points out about the contrast between the EU and the US, you know, our PM regulations are far more relaxed than those in the US. So I think local authorities use this as a yardstick. What's important from a regulatory perspective? What are we about to breach? What are we most risk of exceeding? And really, that's the wrong framing for air pollution. You know, if we're learning anything from evidence today, is that there isn't necessarily a threshold below which you could say that air pollution is safe, or that you could use to set a limit value. So if you looked into the health evidence, the most rational way to tackle this, going into Tom's other question, would be to bring about change. And a lot of the analysis we've done for London has shown that, yeah, air pollution is improving. And you can look up some of the papers we've done, Tom, for the answer to your question, I think, in terms of methods. But what we did notice was that air pollution wasn't necessarily improving for all communities. And whilst we might be kidding ourselves that we're getting closer to limit values and so forth, that wasn't happening uniformly everywhere. And that's becoming increasingly important. So we need to have a policy framework going forward that brings about improvements or lessens the health burden for all communities. And we're not going to achieve that through limit values. We're only going to achieve that through mandating and a decrease in concentrations year on year. And that therefore requires action to be taken, not just in the hotspots, but in the lower concentration areas where people might live away from busy roads and industry.
In a sense, Gary, that's reminding me of how happy local government become when they can report that there's a reduction in the percentage of people living in an area for NO2 and, you know, for annual NO2 levels, because instead of being 40.01, it's become 39.99. You know, which is an irrelevant argument, a completely irrelevant statistic, and flies in the face of, you know, the absence of the threshold effects.
So then, speaking about toxicity, there's been a great question for you, Ian, by Sarah Clark, and it's specifically about dust storms. So dust storms can be a contributor to seasonal PM in some places of the world. But what are your thoughts of the toxicity of said PM with a large dust component? Thanks.
Well, there is a disease. There is a desert lung syndrome, which has been noted, and essentially what you're looking at is a silica storm, and the lung doesn't like silica. So I have no problem with somebody saying dust and wind-blown dust will potentially have a health impact, because I look at the chemistry of what's in the dust purely as a silicate. I can make a complete framework for believing that that would have adverse effects on the lung. But it won't just be the silica, because this wind-blown dust contains biological components as well, often not very well characterized. But there have been episodes of, if you like, dust storms where the health effects have been more related to fungal spores within that aerosol than to the actual silica itself. But I know lots of people say it's fugitive dust, we can't do anything about it, therefore it shouldn't be part of a regulated level. But that doesn't mean it doesn't have health effects. And I think the science would support that you should focus on it and consider it as a health risk.
I think there are things that can be done about it as well, and depends on where you look in the world. But land management, you know, you only think about the US Dust Bowl, but land management is really, really important.
And I suppose one of the last questions for the event will be Annalisa's, which is, to all the speakers, what are your 3 key areas you think are the most important to research or address in the future? So by any means, whoever wants to go first, please volunteer.
Well, I would say start with enforcement of regulations that already exist, because, as I said, I think in Europe and the UK, there's been a propensity to sort of write nice things down on paper, limits of how much pollution is allowed to come out of tailpipes and chimneys and all of that. then a real failure to enforce that actually out in the world. I think looking forward, we also need to, really start concentrating on the overlap between climate solutions and air pollution solutions, because we know that there's a big space there for, some real win-win policies, whether it's, closing coal plants or encouraging active transport and getting people out of their cars. And the third thing, as a Londoner, is that I would mention again, wood smoke is a huge problem. I think there's a real lack of public understanding on this issue, in the sense that wood burning is sort of natural and can't therefore be harmful. That log stoves are sort of cozy and lovely, but in fact. We know that smoke is full of PM 2.5 and all kinds of nasty stuff, which I will leave the toxicologists to itemize, but I know that it's not good for me or any of us. And I know that I smell it when I walk around London in these sort of little miniature hotspots that you can just feel and smell as you walk through them, particularly in the winter, particularly on the weekends and in the evenings when people are sort of kicking back with their glass of wine in their fireplace. So, I would say there needs to be a really big push on again, enforcement of existing rules, because a lot of actually that burning is not legal in this smoke control zones that we have in most British cities, and B, public awareness so that people understand it's actually harming their health and their neighbors' health when they light up these fires, which have, no benefit, generally speaking, in terms of heat. Most people have gas heat and they're just using the fire for sort of a atmospheric leisure kind of activity. So those are my areas.
Okay.
Sure.
I'll go next. Yeah. So Ian, the note on Ian, I think next on the toxicity, because I think that's really important to work out what's driving the adverse effects and how it drives the policy. So yeah, I agree. I'm an epidemiologist who's saying it's the toxicology is really important, Ian. So that would be my number one. My second is on the policy, because it does puzzle me as well. It was one of the questions. We've had air pollution problems for a lot of years. We know there's a problem. Why can't we just sort it out? So I think there's research and work that could be done on what are the most effective levers on policy, and I think people have started to think about that. It's going to take time to work those out, I think. But the third one is, as Beth started talking about, is thinking about the broader picture, because for me, I think the air pollution is just an example of one of the ways in which we're out of sync with nature. We see it with climate change. We've got a lot of ecological problems at the moment, and I think there's a huge sort of, what's the word? I guess sort of global One Health. I think it's One Health perspective, thinking about this, thinking about how we relate to the environment, and seeing if there's something that we can look at from a sort of holistic perspective. And, thinking about co-benefits may be part of that. Thinking about how we reduce transport, for example, has co-benefits for carbon as well as air pollution exposure. And maybe we need to do a lot more work on that, just sort of thinking about things holistically rather than in silos.
Ian?
I go next. Well, guess what? I was going to say we need more toxicology, but now Anna said we need it, so it's definitely the truth. But there's more of a reason to it than that, and it's something I reflected on recently when Andrew Wheeler was made the head of the EPA in the States and began to challenge the strength of the epidemiology. And he said, well, these things should be done like clinical, double-blinded trials. We can't trust the data. I was sitting there the whole time thinking, well, technically speaking, we already have evidence which suggests that air pollution has failed its preclinical and phase 1 trial. So we don't need to do, your argument falls down immediately. If it was a drug, it would not go into development. So, his argument, but nobody linked it. Nobody made that statement. Nobody was there at the table saying the toxicology means your argument falls down, at stage one. So toxicology is important in policy as well, very, very early on, but we don't integrate it well in Europe. I think America do a better job historically of integrating toxicology, sort of experimental studies and epidemiology into integrated assessments, whereas in the United Kingdom and Europe, we've been quite poor at doing that. I think one of the areas we need research in is economics, and that's not only the health benefit, but actually generating realistic health economic valuations for the benefits which reducing air pollution will be. And when I say that, I mean, I know people do it, but to do it in a fashion that the Treasury will actually listen to it. Because if we want to know what the policy lever which makes a change will be, then I think the key is actually being able to get into the Treasury. I think we speak to politicians the whole time across many sort of aspects of government, and they all shrug their shoulders and they say, but the Treasury won't allow it. The Treasury is in the way. The Treasury is where we have to have our discussions. We have to learn how to speak their language. And again, I agree, we have to think about air pollution holistically, not only within the context of our environment, but in terms of a whole host of other public health risks. We have to think about it in terms of obesity, activity, the diet of the population. The whole goal should be to produce an environment which produces the healthiest, happiest population.
I'm not sure what I can really say because you're getting very, very big there. I'm not sure how I can follow that one. I certainly agree with all the points that Beth was starting to make, and everybody else has rolled forward about climate change, air pollution, and joining together our policies, as well as wood burning. I worry a lot about lifelong impacts, and this would change the way in which we would manage air pollution. You've got to say, well, does it matter that we would find that air pollution might have a lifelong impact, or an impact over your life course? Perhaps I should phrase it that way. Well, yes, it would, because it would change the way in which we would look at the exposure for young people, even before birth as well. I worry a little bit about other pollutants like particle number. And you've got to say, well, what difference would it make if we regulated particle number? Well, a huge number of sources that we don't deal with. If we're looking at particle number, UFP or nanoparticles, however you want to frame them, there'd be a huge number of sources that we don't deal with at the moment, principally aircraft. But there's quite a few other ones as well, which brings me to the fact that I worry that there are quite a few sources which are becoming increasingly important that aren't in our regulatory sphere at all. So an obvious one I think I touched on before is brake tyre and road wear, which is becoming the dominant component of what's coming from transport. And, there's no real regulatory frameworks around controlling that at all. Other ones are the home care products and things that we use around the house and their contribution to secondary aerosol. I'm looking around the room now to find like a printer cartridge or something like that to wave, but I haven't got one here. But I also ask another question: should we be really changing our regulatory regime? And that's the most important thing going forward, as we were saying before, getting away from limit values and thinking about ensuring that we improve air pollution for all communities. That's really the important thing. And I know it might not be original to say this, but should we, well, interestingly, DEFRA at the moment is consulting on environmental principles. And if you look at the first draft of the Environment Bill, it had 2 environmental principles, and one was the precautionary principle and the other one was the polluter pays principle. They're now consulting on 5, I think, which I'm sitting here at the moment. I can't remember them all, but there are 5 principles which they think should govern our environmental laws going forward. And none of those are a right to a healthy environment. They are all framed in very different ways. So should we be putting something around the individuals and saying, we have a right to a healthy environment, or right for our health not to be harmed by the air that we breathe and other environmental things? And we need to be using that as a starting point.
I mean, it sounds like we've got lots of work to do. So with that being said, thank you very much for everyone's attendance. Thank you very much to the speakers. I think you've done an incredible job at summarising such a complex field. So I thank you. So from me, thank you very much. Dylan, do you want to say anything to finish off?
Yeah, thank you so much for everyone to attend. Thank you so much for all the speakers. Apologies if we didn't get to your questions, but we had a good 45 minutes of panel discussion there, and I think we got a lot out of it. So thank you so much to everyone.
Yeah, thank you all, and thank you for organising it. I've been missing these type of events so much over the last little while, and it's, I don't know, I'm missing seeing everybody in 3 dimensions. Everybody's just flat thing at the moment, and I look forward to a different world where we can have these types of interaction. I mean, we've done well today, but have these types of interaction and get back to bouncing ideas off each other and shaping the debate and moving it forward. Yeah, really well done.
Thank you so much.
I second that, Gary.
Yeah,
but it was a pleasure talking to you all.
Yeah, brilliant, completely brilliant.
Excellent. Thanks for organizing us, Joseph.